Hi there. My name is Ilgin Nas, and I'm a senior at Harvard College concentrating in Italian studies. I'm joined here today by Dr. Jill Burke, and we'll be discussing her new book, The Italian Renaissance Nude. Dr. Burke, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Hello.
First of all, I would like to inquire about the origins of this project. In the introduction of your book, you mentioned that you had the idea of writing this book after having difficulty finding a book on the development of the Renaissance nude for a class you were teaching. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, I was teaching a class called The Renaissance Body, which I still teach. This was back a long time ago, 2006 or something like that. And I wanted to set a book on the nude, because that's a fundamental thing in art history. In art history is the origins of the nude, but there wasn't one. And this was surprising to me, and I looked again, and I read again, and I thought, this can't be right. But in fact, it was right. And although there's many, many books on artists that depict nude, so there's many books on Michelangelo, endless books on Donatello, on Botticelli, on Titian, all this kind of thing. And this has never been set in a context of why the nude form became important in the first place in the 15th century in Italy. And so because the book didn't exist, I thought, I can write this book. And I initially thought it would be maybe a couple of years or something. And now, 11 years later, it has become a book. But it took a long time because there's an awful lot of primary source reading, a lot of putting things together that was necessary because of the lack of writing on this area.
Mm-hmm. And what specific goals in terms of completing the gaps in the scholarship did you have when you began this project?
My main question was, why did nudes in art become important? And how did the development of art as a separate kind of category, as a separate kind of discipline, which happened in the Renaissance, why did that happen? And what did that mean socially? Because even today, if you look at nudes in society, it's very rare to see other people naked. Right, on the internet, you can see all the naked people you like, but actually if you're in a room with naked people, that's quite a strange experience. And one of the few places that we can look at nudes with, say, our mums or our families is the art gallery. So either nudes are sexualized and thought of in a certain way, or we can look at them in an art gallery and that's acceptable. So I was interested in how that strange thing came to be, and also what effect it had on the viewers, what effect does looking at nudes have on the people who look at it. So those were my central questions, and that was a question that really hadn't been asked, I think, in the literature. The most important previous book was Kenneth Clark's book on the nude, which was written and published in 1956, and which said that the Italian Renaissance nude was an unexplained miracle. But unexplained miracle is not good if you're an academic researcher, and so that was really grist to my mill. I thought, no, we're not allowed to have this is an unexplained miracle. And the other thing that people kind of assumed was that the nude in classical art was revived in the Renaissance, which is absolutely true, but that it was revived in an unproblematic way. That people just saw the skill and the wondrous nature of classical sculptures like the Belvedere Apollo or like sculptures of Venus, and they were so good, they were so full of genius that people thought, these are great and we're just going to copy them, and that was always straightforward. But actually, the really interesting thing about this topic is that the nude has never, ever been straightforward, and it's always been contested, and it's always been something that people argue about and object to.
In your introduction, you mentioned that your first step in composing this book was gathering together pictures of naked bodies. And at this point, did you have an idea about the themes you were going to address in your book, or did these images give you ideas about how to construct your book?
A bit of both. I always tell students, and I try to keep to this, that you have to let your conclusions and your approach be governed by the evidence that you find. So I really objected to some of the way that nudes were talked about in the secondary source material as well. I felt that tends to be a repetition of quite tired tropes in the way that this subject was looked at, related to artistic genius, ideas of kind of transcendental truth, European dominance in the visual arts, and in the understanding of the body that were really problematic. So I tried to not look at that. And what I did first of all is just to gather objects and then create categories of these objects that made sense. So one of the things that I noticed initially was, although that you get female nudes in the 15th century, notably the work of Botticelli, people might know, say, The Birth of Venus or the Primavera, both in the Uffizi Gallery, and there's female nudes in these. But actually, 15th century nudes in Italy are really quite rare. Female nudes in Italy, it's all about the male nude. And then suddenly in the 16th century, relatively suddenly, in Venice first and in Rome, you get this real proliferation of female nudes. So that was one of the things that I kind of knew about anyway, but really became apparent with the gathering together of different kinds of objects and paintings and prints and drawings. And that was a useful way of approaching it.
Mm-hmm. In your book, you discuss these different kinds of artworks to different degrees of detail. Mm-hmm. And how did you decide what artworks would be the centerpieces of your book or in your individual chapters?
That's a really good question, a really hard question to answer. My approach has been traditionally, really since doing my PhD, my first book, related to case studies. So I'm interested in looking at objects particularly that are hard to understand and hard to explain. And that's an approach that I took really from historians who use anthropology a lot. I did a history degree originally, and I was very interested in anthropological history. And there's an idea that historians like Robert Darnton, who wrote a great essay called The Great Cat Massacre, and Carlo Ginzburg, who's a wonderful Italian historian, who wrote a famous book called The Cheese and the Worms. And they start with they actually use text, but they start with texts that are really confusing. So a massacre of cats in Paris in the 18th century, or a miller from Friuli explaining his worldview through comparing the world to a cheese with worms in it, this kind of thing. And if you start by looking at something that's profoundly odd, then you have to think about the structures of meaning that exist in that society in order to make sense of it. How did contemporaries make sense of these things? So that's how I started. I started off by real close looking. It's very important in art history to really engage with the objects and think about how they can be used as primary sources. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in my chapter on the male nude and the construction of the male nude, I start by looking closely at a drawing by Michelangelo of Haman, partly because that was a very beautiful drawing. So partly it's I could have used many different drawings for that. Partly it was aesthetic choice. Mm-hmm. Partly it was availability of reproductions, which is something that isn't always discussed when art historians talk, but actually I started looking at British images from the British Museum, particularly because they have high quality reproductions that are available that aren't that expensive to reproduce, because some copyrights are crazily expensive. So some of the images that I use as case studies could have been replaced. There were some objects that I thought, if you're writing a book on the nude, you really have to include. I knew I had to include The Birth of Venus by Botticelli. I knew I had to include the Sistine Chapel ceiling. I knew I had to include Michelangelo's David, The Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci. I knew I had to include Titian's female nudes and some mythological nudes. And I was kind of resistant to including some of these big and famous objects, because I also wanted to look at things that people didn't know. But I knew that you couldn't really write a book on the nude without engaging with them and then putting them in a broader context. So lots of different decisions were made.
Was it your priority to kind of share an opinion regarding some of the big debates in art history regarding these big artworks, paintings, sculptures?
Yeah, I mean, most of the book engages with very recent art historical debates about these things. The trend in art history, in Renaissance art history recently, has been to look particularly at things like sexuality. That was very big in the first decade of the 2000s. And increasingly people are kind of turning their attention away from Italian Renaissance art, quite rightly, and things like Florentine art particularly, to look at different places, to question the narratives on which art history is based, which is very centred in this idea of art beginning again, you know, the Renaissance of art in 15th and 16th century Italy. And so I was interested in engaging with that. One of the issues in writing a book of this kind is the relationship between the big ideas and the macro kind of story that we have to tell as art historians, and those small, the small detailed research that is involved with every single object that is in a museum has its own research file, has its own set of debates about attribution, for example, and particularly with the drawings. This is often really contested and often still not known. There's a lot of fundamental stuff that is still not known, and maybe can never be known about some of the objects from the 15th and 16th centuries, just because of the lack of primary source material. So it was a balance, and it's always hard as an art historian to know quite where to draw the line there between very detailed analysis and kind of the big ideas.
Earlier you mentioned that you looked into contemporary attitudes about these artworks or about nakedness in general. So I thought this was one of the most interesting aspects of your book, that you make references to the contemporary attitudes. And I was wondering, if you could please tell us more about how you went about finding these contemporary perspectives on these issues.
I read sources no matter where they come from. So I am much more interested in the audience of artworks than I am in the artists. And that maybe comes through in all my work. I don't really, it's a great advantage not to mind particularly who creates some of these art objects. Other art historians do, and they do important work, and I'm not saying that's a bad approach. But I don't really care about artists. So I am interested in audiences. I'm interested in the whole texture of a life that makes you give meaning to something. So it struck me as, if we don't know how people understand nakedness in the 15th century or the 16th century, how can we possibly have any sense of how they understand the nude? And that was my first task. That was my first research task. And so I read texts that I knew would be useful, so sermons, for example, texts relating to sexuality, literature, some early erotica, Pietro Aretino. I read quite a lot of Aretino. I read texts, legal texts to do with sumptuary legislation, because there's laws in some Italian states about whether you're allowed to cover your genitals or not, and how old, once you get to the age of 14, you have to start covering your genitals, this kind of thing. So there's an awful lot of material that's outside the normal purview of art history. But even just, now texts are searchable, just searching for keywords like nudo and nudo, seeing where they come up, seeing where people are talking about this. And this is one of the things that I included in the book to some extent, but also wrote a separate article about, is how nudity came up frequently when discussing non-Europeans. Because this is the age of discovery, what we call obviously these places have been discovered by other people, by the age of European discovery, and nudity and nakedness comes up a lot in describing sub-Saharan Africans and New World peoples. And that is tied into a whole set of ideas about civilization and clothing. That was actually one of the most significant things I think that I found when doing this research.
And it's also very interesting that you mentioned how nakedness doesn't necessarily mean no clothes at all.
Yeah.
So I thought that was very interesting.
It's actually, what nakedness means is not as clear as you might think. And this differs in different societies and different cultures. So in the Italian Renaissance, nakedness just meant wearing clothes not enough clothes to be socially acceptable. So men would be described as naked if they were wearing their underwear. Women would be described as naked if they were wearing these big camicie, these big shifts that are ubiquitous in the period. Men also wear them too. But if a woman was just wearing that, she would be described as naked. And these kind of reach from the shoulders to the knee. So they wouldn't correspond with what we think of as nakedness at all. But it's significant that in this period, female nakedness is much more feared, really, much more prescribed than it is now, certainly in Italy.
It's definitely interesting to find out about these details and also find out about what clothing meant and symbolized for them. So, Going back to Pietro Aretino,
Uh-huh.
so the Renaissance is also known as the period when pornography came into existence. And I was wondering what you think the difference is between naked images or nudity in art versus pornography.
There is no difference, I don't think. It's all to do with who's looking. A lot of the artistic discourse relating to images of nudes in Italy talked about how artists should create a physical reaction in the viewer. And if artists were able to evoke an erotic reaction in the viewer, that was kind of testament to the skill of the artist. So in some ways that seems to be quite similar to what we now term pornography. Pornography is not a term that was used in the Renaissance. However, what's different is who's looking. And so when Giulio Romano makes drawings of sexual positions and they circulate around the Roman court, around the papal court, this is fine. When Marcantonio Raimondi engraves them as I Modi, and then Aretino writes a series of sonnets about them, then this suddenly becomes really problematic because the audience changes, because the audience becomes much greater, because there's a risk that the audience will not know all the classical references that form this kind of clothing in some ways for the nude. And that's the difference. The difference is who's looking and the amount of education it takes to look. So one of the things I talk about in the last chapter is how male elite sociability is formed around talking about images of the nude, and particularly images of nude women, and how it's about differentiating these people from the people who shouldn't be looking. And so the nude is part of a whole set of ideas that come forth in the 16th century that you can also see in things like Castiglione's Courtier, about how the elites, both male and female, but in this case particularly male, should hold themselves, should regulate their bodies, and should be in control of their bodies. So that's, sorry, a very long answer, but although the images between art and pornography might not look different, the audience and the way the audience is meant to react to them is different.
It's very interesting, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And how has the reception of your book been so far? Have you had any reactions? What kinds of reactions have you received?
My book came out in July, and an exhibition I was involved in, The Renaissance Nude, was at the Getty in Los Angeles, and that opened in October and is now transferred to the Royal Academy in London. So I've had quite a lot of reaction to this whole subject, partly because of the exhibition, and there was a false news story, there was a fake news story that came out as part of the exhibition that said that we'd imposed a gender quota, in the light of Me Too, that we'd imposed a gender quota on male and female nudes in this exhibition, that we'd counted the number of nudes in each picture, and it's completely not true at all. But this was reported, it was reported here on ABC News, it was reported on the BBC, in the Times, in the Telegraph, all this kind of thing. And so suddenly the Guardian asked me to comment on it, and it became a big thing. And so in the wake of that, I've had much more attention, press attention to my book than you'd maybe expect for an academic art history book. So it's been an interesting year. Quite a lot of interviews and discussions, and quite a lot of writing in the wake of the exhibition.
I guess the topic is still controversial even today.
Absolutely, yeah.
And do you have any follow-up projects to this book, or are you working on a new project that's relevant perhaps to the topic?
Originally, when I first started this project, I wanted to write very much about the effect that nudes had on the viewer. Mm-hmm. But actually, because there was so little written about the nude in the first place, it was almost impossible to do, because it would have been an enormous, enormous book that no one would have published. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm looking at women particularly, and how women tried to change their bodies in order to meet beauty ideals that are laid out in the 16th century in the female nude. So I'm looking at dieting, I'm looking at body hair removal, I'm looking at things like how to shape your hips and your breasts and your thighs to meet these ideals. And I'm looking particularly at 16th century advice books for women that give them recipes and advice how to change their bodies.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much, Dr. Rourke. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today.